Welcome to the Cove Podcast, your stop for PME on the go.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to the Cove Podcast. I'm your regular host, Captain Todd Lemper. And on today's episode, we're going to talk about adaptation or adapting to the threat. And we're going to use Russia and Ukraine as a case study. We haven't touched Russia or Ukraine since Dr. Jack Watling's episode, The Future of Land Warfare. I'll drop the episode link in the show notes. But this is sort of more on and centered on adaptation as a result of some of the more current and emerging threats within Russia and Ukraine. My guest today is Lieutenant Colonel James Ellis-Smith. He's an intelligence officer and he's the G72 at 4Com headquarters. So I'll ask you about that in 2 seconds. But he's also studying a PhD at the Australian National University in Intelligence Studies. Welcome, sir.
Yeah, great. Thanks for having me on. And great to be doing this on Wandjirabara country as part of the Yugambeh Nation. This is my home turf, so great to have you up here, mate.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm visiting as well at Canungra here doing a course. Just before we do punch into the content, which is going to be, centered on long-range precision strike,
yep.
UAS proliferation, TTPs and adaptation, combined arms tactics, trench warfare, we're going to touch everything. But just before we do go into that, I suppose G72 at 4Com headquarters, so the training intelligence cell, is it new and what's the purpose of it?
Yeah, it's incredibly new. Like that's really my whole remit is to come in and help build this. And so it's part of the Battle Lab, and the Battle Lab's a relatively new organisation as well. It's consolidated a whole bunch of the learning, doctrine, lessons, sort of simulation sort of entities that were in Forces Command before into a single organisation. And the aim is that in that single organisation we can drive a lot of adaptation within Army. And then being part of 4Com that can be injected straight into the land domain training system. So, I've been asked to come in to help establish the G72, so the intelligence function within the G7 as part of the Battle Lab. And it's part of a broader Army effort to have or ensure we have threat-informed training. So it's hey, have we got a baseline of everything we do in the training and doctrine space from a realistic understanding of the threat and the environment? And the simplest way that I sort of try to explain it in terms of what the purpose of intelligence is, because it's not an intelligence function like you would see in a typical operational context, which is supporting command decisions. It's really about saying, hey, your training, in any given context for an organisation, the training system will begin baselined against what we know of the threat and the environment. But over time, as we make incremental decisions, there's a risk that what's happening with the training system and what's happening in the real world will start to diverge. So the really simple reduction of it is we need to know what's happening over here. We need to know what's happening from a threat perspective and from an environmental perspective because it's about risk. We got to know what's the gap between what we're training to, what we're generating skilled workforce to do, and what's actually happening in the world, so that when we make decisions about what we're doing with the training system, we know what risk we're carrying. And ideally, we want to bring those lines closer together.
Bring the threat assessment back onto line OT sort of thing.
Well, correct. So vector back on to go, hey, our training system is in line with, or we're generating people and skills that are in line with what they expect to face. And it's really then making risk-informed or threat-informed decisions about where you do specific types of training and where you inject, specific sort of things about threat at different levels of fidelity. So
that's awesome because it gives that refined threat and some more realistic context. And I think you can use realistic sort of training aids or circumstances and case studies, which is exactly what we're going to do today to inform your training. So that's the 4Com headquarters G72 and the intelligence cell in our training organisation. But if we come back to the case study today being Ukraine, Russia, I suppose what we should first start with, noting we haven't touched it since Dr. Watling, is the context and operational overview for the Ukraine-Russia conflict.
Yeah, absolutely. So, this conflict sort of beginning in 2022 with the Russian invasion, it's gone obviously for a couple of years now and it's gone through a couple of iterative phases in terms of the nature of the warfighting that we've seen there. And so from our perspective, we have to acknowledge that there's obviously incredible suffering and it's an incredibly difficult, dangerous, bloody war for, everyone involved. But from a learning and development perspective, it's a fascinating case study to look at the application of contemporary technologies in warfighting and particularly in the land context. So with that Russian invasion, what we're talking about is like, this initial push, a rapid offensive in to try and seize Kiev that has now essentially stagnated into a protracted defensive land conflict. That is essentially a strategic stalemate now, and it's an incredibly fluid situation. It's it's a difficult one to sort of pinpoint who is holding the specific advantage in any one time. But overall, you'd say, it's a stalemate, and we're not seeing significant gains being made in the land conflict itself either way, at least recently. That's the broader context of what we're seeing from that. Yeah,
and from us, again, not to diminish like the sort of context of the fighting over there, but we're seeing a return to conventional sort of warfare and that occupation of territory type stuff, a land battle between two nations on a the land border sort of thing. So that was interesting to come back to trench warfare and stuff. And we're going to talk about capabilities in 2 seconds, but incredibly interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. It's we haven't seen conventional land conflicts in Europe since, the Second World War, essentially. So it's really interesting to sort of look at how quickly it's come back to some very fundamental principles of land warfare, driven by logistics, driven by the nature of having these, these contiguous borders that allow for a massive force flow of men and material, or personnel and material in, and how that's shaped the nature of what that fight is. And we'll touch this in the end, is like where we then have to be very deliberate is to say, what of this is a universal lesson for what is an evolution of land warfare in all context versus what is a very specific, observed trend on the basis that it is a protracted predominantly land, conventional conflict. And why that's important is because we have to say, hey, we don't want to take everything we see from this conflict and assume that it's going to be applied in the same way in conflicts in our primary operating environment or ones that we are planning for, because we won't see the translation of lessons in that way. Yeah,
we'll get to the detail on that at the end of the episode before we go through the threats. But I suppose before we get to the adaptation, I think it's important to go through the threats, the current capabilities and threats on both sides. Can we start with, I suppose, long range? Would you like to start with long range precision strike and then walk through UAS and the like as well?
Yeah, well, it's the best place to start because it is the core of what we're seeing in terms of the application of technology is being played out in the capability and proliferation of long range fires.
I think, Dr. Watling said, in the last century, OS fires has killed more people than anything else.
Yeah, and it's true for this conflict as well. It's that that statistically is continuing. So, we sort of talked about this it's the next iterative step in that same trend that's been continuing, right? The critical thing about how we're seeing those things proliferate in the Ukraine is just the volume and the level at which we see those fires being available at all echelons of command. And I'll talk to why that is in a second. But, we've got the proliferation of self-propelled artillery, got self-propelled artillery being used by both Russia and Ukraine. It allows for a mobility of fires and a use of fires in a contested conventional warfighting context. We're still seeing sort of towed guns being used, but the tactical restrictions on how you can use towed guns in this context are really significant. It requires a lot of very specific TTPs of how you can use towed artillery because of the innate vulnerability of those systems when you have such a prolific and capable counter battery and UAS threat that is able to find and fix, guns really quickly once they're en masse. So self-propelled artillery has become really significant. We're also seeing self-propelled artillery in broader theatre as well, just as a segue. The IDF is using it prolifically in sort of their conflicts as well. So it's a really significant factor. The proliferation of sort of the next iterative level of loitering munitions, though, the market, the international arms market for loitering munitions that are now available to a wider range of actors. So the Russians, using Turkish and other sort of, manufactured munitions, and using the sort of Lancet is one of their sort of quintessential, really prolific sort of weapon systems they're using, allows them to have a proliferation or have those fires really readily available to be able to target and operationally, available at that sort of brigade and division level to have those munitions available. We talked about as well the proliferation of precision air munitions as well. And what's that been? And that is the sort of glide bomb technology. What's significant about that is that is a really a sort of a bracket or a sort of external attachment that goes onto a conventional munition. The munitions released, it allows, that sort of attachment then folds out, is precision guided. It can be guided on. But what's significant, and then you can basically then use it to essentially turn a conventional munition into a precision munition.
Yeah, so you're converting like dumb bombs into GPS guided.
Correct. Which, and this is particularly on the Russian side, but because they have such an extraordinarily large stockpile of conventional munitions that date back, the Soviet era, it'd be very difficult to use those and make them applicable tactically as they are. They're used en masse. They're used for large-scale bombing, and they're very prolific with the use of that. But to be able to use them to support tactical actions is very difficult. But you attach this thing to it, it turns it into a precision weapon, but it turns it into one really cheaply. That's significant because you can push that down to lower and lower levels, or you'll see that used more and more prolifically because there's more of them available. It's cheaper. What that means for the lived experience for the soldier is, you're going to see precision munitions used against you far more often. So we have to factor that into our thinking about what we're responding to. And then sort of at the far end, you've got, again, that market, the international market for long-range drones that can be used for strikes up to sort of 1,000 to 2,000 kilometres. That then gives them additional capability in terms of being able to reach far back beyond the flot and target, logistics and enabling and supporting infrastructure and sort of operational to strategic targets well beyond the forward lines. All of those things are driven by that common factor of those capabilities, those weapons. We've seen versions of those technologies, precision technologies and fires technologies around for, many decades now. What has changed or what is being manifest in Ukraine is just how prolifically they're being used because of how much cheaper they've become.
Yeah, and I think before we get to the UAS component, which you just touched on, if we talk about target engagement, you talked about pushing fires down to a lower level than we have seen.
Yep.
Subsequently, how's the targeting cycle? Is that quicker as a result of practice, or how do they get that from observer seeing a target or whatever through to ammunition on the target? How quickly is that?
Well, like the sensor to shooter sort of link has shrunk. So we're talking typically, and it's difficult because different sources we work through, at various times and stuff have very different brackets for this, but typically between 2 to 5 minutes is the metric that's used between identification, acquisition, and then targeting. And of that, less than 2 minutes of that is the initial acquisition. So how that then, the impact that has in your thinking around maneuver and how quick and adaptive and responsive you have to be when you do anything in the battle space, it's incredibly impactful, And Jack Watling, made a really interesting point though of like the challenge then is actually sifting. It's no longer a challenge of finding the entity anymore. Like that's not the problem. It's, do you have the command and control and information management mechanisms to be able to identify that entity and then, apply fire against it? That's the more significant factor because of the capacity of surveillance and the capacity of those, detection methodologies and all that kind of stuff as well. So it incredibly short.
Yeah. So I suppose if we move to UAS and the sensor, you talked about sensor to shooter. Let's talk about the sensor, but also I suppose from an offensive support weapon as well, UAS. Yeah. You talk about, we've seen coverage of swarming and certain different things across the world, but like the prevalence of UAS inside the Russia-Ukraine conflict is sort of unparalleled. I would making a assessment, but can you talk about UAS and its use in the Russia-Ukraine conflict? Yeah,
so like you've hit the nail on the head. It's the volume of UAS of varying types that has been pumped through this conflict is really the key characteristic. So we've got metrics around, at any one time up to sort of 250 UAS of varying types and capabilities, in any 5 kilometre area is one metric I've seen for how I sort of talk to that. And the volume of UAS, meaning that, and what the so what is just complete saturation of surveillance. So UAS is, it's still the case that surveillance, the capacity for UAS is to support surveillance and battlefield awareness is their most significant impact. In practical terms, the sort of what we're talking to is that within 3 kilometers of the flight, you have almost total saturation of surveillance. So everything is seen within that bracket, and then diminishing but still very capable surveillance out to about 15 kilometers, and then targeted fidelity, high fidelity, and latency on being able to detect things out to about 40 kilometers from the flight. And so what I mean by that is you won't have complete saturation of UAS over every area out to 40 kilometers, but you can task a UAS and can find anything that you're queued onto within about that 40 kilometers. Now, that's an extraordinary surveillance environment to be operating under if you are a force that's in that environment. Like it very significantly impacts your maneuver and what you can and can't do, or how you have to tailor what it is, your use of the battle space. I'll talk to a point though, and probably should have prefaced this at the start. Our assessment on how we make sense of this is that doesn't fundamentally change a key tenet of what has been true for contemporary warfare for 130 years at least, is around if you're seen or you're exposed, you are exposed to lethal fires. That has been a fundamental tenet of land maneuver for a very long time. So that fundamental tenet hasn't changed. So it is just about an adaptation. So that, and what we saw is an adaptation of thinking when in the early parts of the last century around, we need to adapt our ways of maneuvering so that we aren't exposed. That's still true now, but we're just seeing a sort of iterative development of where we have to apply that principle and the depths to which we have to apply that principle. That's really the fundamental change that UAS has that is the change that has been driven by US, is because of their sort of the saturation. But they're still, and this comes back to the point about long range fires, and commanders there are still reporting that they're most effective or they're most impactful as a cue for artillery.
Yeah,
conventional
not
artillery.
As an attack platform. Yeah,
no, not any of themselves. And there's some really interesting statistics, some contradictory statistics about the sort of ratio of anywhere. I've seen different ratios in terms of less than 10% up to about 30 to 40% of actual UAS strike missions actually being successful, and far more impactful against dismounted personnel than against platforms and weapon systems. So when we talk about the actual use of UAS, so we've got FPV drones and very well publicized sort of use of drones for lethal targeting and stuff. That it is evolving, like this is a rapidly moving thing, but certainly up to this point in the conflict, a relatively low success rate of them actually being used for those purposes. And then when they actually are successfully striking against platforms and stuff, their ability to actually do significant damage to a platform that it's rendered inoperable, the statistics actually suggest that it's not a significant impact in that way. But Ukrainian commanders at least will talk about the fact that their bigger challenge, and we'll get to logistics later, is actually being able to have enough guns and enough ammunition to be able to target off the surveillance that they're getting from those UASs. That's the bigger challenge for them.
So talk about the constraints of, so you talked about UASs queuing or like observing for artillery or offensive support. Can we talk about the constraints of UAS, I suppose, as a result? Like we put a joint fires observer out, and with rain, hail or shine, they sit on top of man and OP or
complain, but
we can't really do that with UAS. I suppose we've talked about all the things it can do, and it's highly publicised what UAS can do. But as a capability, I suppose, what are the constraints?
Well, it's a really good point. It's constrained by the weather. It's constrained by the obscurance. It's constrained by and we see a shaping of maneuver, or we've seen reports of shaping of maneuver. So it happens at dawn and dusk because you've got the transition of light states. So it is like any platform. It's constrained in terms of its surveillance capabilities. If atmospheric conditions or anything like that aren't there, it has payload and endurance constrictions, like for any given platform as well. So that is offset somewhat by just how many of them are there, but they can't be all pervasive. And the fundamental principle there is that they also can't take ground. Like they are a key enabler of other forms of maneuver and fires, but in and of themselves they can't achieve that decisive impact. And also the actual use. So the other thing as well is, like, most of the time these things are being operated off like handheld devices, so, and whilst the platform itself, if you put it on a giant screen and go, wow, I've got this total stage, I can see over this kind of stuff, but most of the time it's still an operator using it off something like the size of an iPad or an iPhone. Or if you're an FPV operator, your goggles. Not everyone's actually good at that. Like from the reports of like, it actually takes a bit to train someone to be able to use the drones well. And that's before you then tap on top of that EW and jamming, which is the main way that these things have been, UAS have been counted, is just the jam signals. Now there's adaptations around that as well, but we get into this cycle of like the continual technological adaptation. But what it is indicative of is that there is no infallible technology that's going to, this is the thing that's going to change everything. It's like, no, it like everything else, to get fed into a cycle of like tactical and technological adaptations around and with that system to be able to use it in. And yeah, so coming back to that point is like, specifically what we're seeing in sort of Ukrainian offensive planning is much more geared around working around the constraints of UAS and the constraints of surveillance, but also I'll just segue back, using smoke, using obscurance, using tactical maneuver, using effective cover and concealment where you're able to do so, discipline, all these kind of things that come back to like how, things that haven't really changed in terms of what makes you successful in the battle space. Those things are equally really effective, or can be really effective, or are drivers of being able to counter drones.
And rather than being completely unseen, because you've just made the argument that you'll be seen within 40 kilometres of the flight to a certain degree, varying degrees. Yeah. It's more about, I suppose, complicating the back end that you were talking about, that targeting cycle for selecting targets, like what is valuable enough to strike, and that.
Well, that's right. What that drives is dispersion. So what that drives is that you break down into smaller and smaller force elements at any given time, so that you are sitting below the targeting threshold. You're not an attractive target, and the nature of maneuver becomes, how do you mass at a decisive point when you've set the conditions in the right way so that you can achieve an effect that requires conventional mass, but you're not sitting as a conventionally mass force in a way that we might have become accustomed to, in the past. So that's what drives that thinking around going, okay, the nature of this, the battle space has changed, or it's evolved because of the pervasiveness of surveillance, but the fundamental principles of my response to it around maneuver, application of tactics, use of cover and concealment, setting appropriate conditions so that you can achieve specific effects, whether it's offensively or defensively, that is exactly, that's the same as it always been. Drones are also sort of probably effective in the surprising ways around this. The psychological impact of drones is probably the bit that is really significant in terms of, I use the comparison of it's the dive bomber sound of the contemporary warfighting context, of the sound of a high pitched whine drone. The psychological impacts of being observed and being surveilled like that is something that has been a significant impact, and we're seeing that bleed into our system. We're seeing soldiers paying much more attention to that now than it's something they can feel or tangibly touch of that we are under a surveillance envelope now. That's a really significant thing. The sort of last point I put on drones is what the observation that is most interesting to me about drones is how culturally, certainly we can talk to the Ukrainians, how they are thinking about drones as a platform now. And so, well, to come back to it, they view drones as expendable ammunition, not as platforms, because of how they're being employed. And so we're talking stacks of drones out in a back room ready to just be picked up, launched. And when you talk about Russian tactics of launching 20 to 30 FPV drones as part of, the initial assault wave going into a defensive position, it's ammunition. It's not a platform. And that cultural pivot, that's a really important thing in terms of, you can't adapt TTPs if your fundamental appreciation of what the platform is and how you use it is, as a exquisite platform or exquisite capability, if your adversary is using it as a mast, is using it as ammunition. So that cultural and mindset shift is the thing that has to happen first before you can start talking around TTPs and doctrine and, things like that.
So like pushing drones forward, like ammo to an ammo point and then being collected and fired basically. And then subsequently when the ammo point gets low, that being the stockpile of drones, it just continues to get reinforced and expended, just sort of thing. And
well, if you take the first cognitive leap of going drones or ammunition, you start thinking about it the way you should, which is what is our operational resupply and sustainment? That it's a supply and sustainment problem, not less a tactical problem. Or you can do the tactical adaptations to use the drone, but if you haven't thought about the sustainment and supply problem, it's a moot point, because you just won't be able to sustain the volume of, if you're fighting in the context of what Ukraine is, you just won't be able to sustain the fight. So you have to make that adaptation first, because then you can think about, okay, this is like 152, this is gun shells, this is what this is. And we have to think about it like that. And we have to think about this as a sustainment and supply and distribution problem.
You made an argument like that how quickly this adaptation is happening.
Yeah.
Like it's quicker than I think everyone imagines it to be. I mean, those that are following the conflict will understand. But how quickly are they adapting to these sort of changes in different threat? I mean, we talk about nets for drones, talk about technicals firing, and so we'll get into that as well. But like, how quickly are they combating these or adapting? Sorry,
I couldn't give you it takes 2 days to adapt to a technology. I don't know that, other than to go, it's very quickly. But the broader point around that is that's adaptation under evolutionary pressure. Like that's probably the more important thing to recognize, is that the reason it's so quick is because you're being pressed by a very capable adversary. And that's significant because, to sort of pair back to the role of the Battle Lab and the role of the G7 too, it's how do you replicate as best as you can that kind of crucible of adaptation, which is to go, well, you've got to adapt because you're being constantly pressed. This thing that worked a week ago doesn't work anymore. So what's our offset around that? And the Ukrainians are very well supported by both local industry, local innovation, local tech development, and obviously sort of Western arms supply and support. But it's been primarily driven by homegrown innovation and tactical innovation in terms of how these things are being used. In terms of the actual countermeasures themselves, and this is the other point, is that it's not one specific. So anyone who's looking for a technological solution to countering drones, you're missing the point. Like technologies, jammers, stuff that works to sort of counter the signals of drones, that they're really significant and they're factored into offensive planning. But it is a layered an interdependent counter-UAS approach that is in part technology, but is significantly about TTPs and how you maneuver in the battle station, is what we talked about before. And then very rudimentary things like netting and things like that allows you to have an offset from an FPV drone or a dropped munition or something like that. And we talked last time about it also is more important that we're talking about, hey, our force structures and how we do maneuver adapts to this. So, we talk about mobile fire teams in Ukraine. So one of their most significant counters to long range, the Shahid UASs are these mobile fire teams, which are like technicals. They're guys in the back of pickup trucks that are queued into the path of these drones and essentially just attempt to shoot them down. And part of the reason that they're relatively successful is because in and of themselves, these MFTs are not worth dropping an expensive long-range munition on, because it's a couple of guys in the back of a pickup truck. But queuing 5 or 6 of them into the path of a drone significantly increases your chances that you're going to be able to shoot it down. However, there was no such thing as an MFT on the Orbat of the Ukrainian armed forces at the start of the war. It is an in-train adaptation, and it's driven by this is what works. That's the key part to look at, is structural and doctrinal for what we'd know as doctrine.
Complement technological advancement.
Correct. Yeah. To complement that. And it comes back to you can't not have enabling technologies. You're going to be overrun by someone who does.
Jamming.
But jamming is a good example. We're now seeing fibre optic drones. So if you'd put all your eggs in the basket of we've got jamming technologies and that's going to solve the counter-UAS problem, well, that's great until you start using fibre optically controlled drones that can't be jammed, which is now highly prevalent particularly from the use of FPV drones, which is literally them flying out on a wire that allows them, and it, been used by ATGMs and things like that have used, wire guided, that's not a new technology. But again, it's like if you are relying on a counter UAS technology, well, you're done.
Yeah.
So it is more important that it is a whole of force adaptation to and a constant adaptation to these technologies and systems. That's the most important part.
I suppose that the jamming then went to more sophisticated jamming and then went to fly-by-wire effectively, but fibre optics. Yeah.
I mean, that's you use the correct military terms for this sort of stuff, mate. Like,
Is there a double-edged sword? You talked about everything having a sort of in balance, I suppose, as being the common thread. I suppose fibre optics drones, do they lead, double-edged sword, do they lead back to the site at which they were launched? Is that like something that happens for, say, a drone is sent out on fibre optics and then you can follow the fibre optic cable back to the site of launch?
You could. It's probably just easier to find it by a drone.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Yeah, I meant, hydraulically following up.
Like you could. So in theory you could, but it's like anything else you'd like to have probably left by then. But there's really interesting, the volume of these things is really, is the other thing that you watch. There's footage of a Ukrainian FPV operator walking through a field, and as he's walking, spools and spools of fibre optic wire are collecting against his legs and sort of trailing behind him, because it's just the amount of drones being launched off that, it's just laid out in the field, So the answer to your specific question is you probably could, but no, it's
unrealistic. Okay. So if we move from that's UAS and drone usage, I suppose to more combined arms tactics, I think we're talking about going back to conventional land sort of forces. Can we go to the combined arms tactics in Russia, Ukraine, which I suppose has interested a lot of people in terms of returning back to that?
Yeah, I think the important point up front is that it's not quite accurate to say they're combined arms tactics. You'd say they are analogous enough to combined arms that it's an academic point. When it's coming at you, it doesn't make a great deal of difference. But the distinction is that, particularly so we're specifically talking here about the Russian, the evolution of Russia as a adversary and their sophistication. It's not combined arms because they're not integrated, and you don't have the various elements of those systems working in concert in the way that we would sort of characterize combined arms. But it is probably more accurate to say it's a sequencing of effects that is effective enough that it presents some really difficult tactical dilemmas, particularly for defenders. And so the one that we talk to is the offensive triangle, which is the combination of dismounted infantry, FPV drones, and glide bombs. That between the three of those things, what the Russians are very good at is massed fires, massed infantry assaults, using FPV drones to hit hardened points in your defensive position, hit any tanks or artillery that you unmask as part of your defensive posture, essentially fix a defensive position in place, but then using glide bombs to essentially just come over the top and obliterate the defensive position or any defensive hard points. Now that's really difficult to counter. Well, the Ukrainians have found that very difficult to counter because it essentially you're stuck there. There's not really a great deal of effective tactical responses to that. If they can cue all of those things at the same time or layer those effects, it's very difficult to counter, and they can put such a volume of fire and people into a position that without significant enabling effects and capabilities, it's almost impossible to resist that. So what we see the Russians doing is they'll disperse, they'll do reconnaissance in section strength, identify a position, and they'll just keep pushing cheap, dispensable infantry in until they've massed enough people to essentially assault and take those forward positions. Now, this is done in concert with fire, as I said before, firing FPVs into hard points as they can find them, and then take those preliminary positions, take the forward edge of the defensive position, and then bring in better troops using trucks or armoured mobility to essentially just short of the defensive position, and then they will roll through and clear the subsequent positions or the subsequent defensive, the subsequent defence. So But again, it comes back to the pit of like there's such a proliferation of those fires, loitering munitions and glide bombs and stuff that it's tactically available to them and they can do it. Now, the Ukrainians have responded by typically, or sort of what's reported is being much more loose and flexible and dispersed defensive positions, so that they can pivot and move and they're not fixed in place to the same extent. But what it reflects is that, and there's some great quotes about this, is that you can't look at Russia or any other adversary and go, we're going to overcome these guys through our innate superiority in combined arms tactics. We've had a monopoly on that, or a perceived monopoly on that, for all of my professional military experience and so the decades before that. What this is showing is that they'll adapt, and what works trumps everything else. So I think the key learning point is if we begin a future conflict with a superiority in the application of combined arms tactics, we won't hold that advantage for very long. For something that is good enough that it will be able to, work just as effectively. And I made the point about that's really interestingly played out in how the reports about how North Korean troops were being used. And in the early stages, reports of, hey, they're really fit, capable, disciplined, good fighting infantry in comparison to the Russian, like a typical Russian infantryman. Started the conflict with, when they came in, wave attacks, like operating as a company strength, conventional maneuver, fighting into the position, overwhelming a position. At that point, the Ukrainians had already made their pivot to this decentralized defensive array to counter Russian offensives. And so, at least in the early stages, were kind of overwhelmed because they were hit in mass. But what happened? The North Koreans started taking casualties, and they started losing too many people doing those sort of offenses. So what happened? They pivoted, and now at least reports would suggest that they fight in exactly the same way that the Russians do. What I find interesting about, and we talked about what really now the key difference is things like, the proportion of them that get taken prisoner is far less. They'll typically, or the reports would suggest that they will commit suicide before they'll get captured. And there are reports to suggest that they, as a proportion, kill more prisoners than the Russians do. Now you might say that there's cultural attributes to that. You'd have to look at it a bit better. But what's interesting about it is that that's the last vestiges of difference, essentially, between them and the Russians. Because what is more important than anything is what works. And it comes back to that point of like, we should expect adversaries to work to the same principle of going, it's going to be what works that trumps everything really quickly. Yeah.
Another interesting point is, so if we zoom in on that trench warfare stuff and the different ways in which Russians are trying to attack these main defensive positions for the Ukrainians, can you just talk about how they're going about doing that?
Yeah, so I think but again, it's like the important thing to talk about in terms of trench. So yes, trench warfare is a quintessential part of this conflict. What we have to be careful though is it comes back to that point at the start, is like, to what extent do we invest time and resources in being really good at fighting trench warfare if we have to make a sort of circumspect judgment about, do we expect battlefield conditions in our POE to evolve the same way? Like, the Russian-Ukraine war is a trench war because what happens is that if two opposing land forces meet, they'll try and bypass each other until they hit a hard border, and then they'll go down like that. Or we can't go sideways anymore. We're digging in. That and that happened in the world wars. Like, that's exactly certainly the First World War. So we see so I think the characterizing thing is like we're going back. What we've seen is going back to the use of trench warfare and trench tactics and Soviet doctrine around defensive positions and everything like that. That is largely the same as it's been previously. You see some characterizing differences between Ukrainian and Russian trench systems, or at least are reported, and I mentioned some of them before in terms of the Ukrainians tending towards having more fluid defensive positions that decentralize forces a little bit more, but largely the principles of trench warfare are exactly the same as, and they use nets and overhead cover to a greater extent than what we would have seen in trench warfare historically, but it's pretty much the exact same thing. Like, fighting from a hole in the ground is fighting from a hole in the ground, So it's been really interesting to see that development. that's driven by the fact that you've got such an abundance of force flow of people and materials into this fight that you inevitably will hit trench warfare and you can sustain trench warfare. That's why that's come into that. But other than that, it's not, we're getting, it's a revision of of defensive procedures and defensive techniques that have been around for a very long time.
So I suppose that it's the trench warfare stuff and how relevant or irrelevant it is to the fighting in our primary operating environment. But if we come back to we've already talked about.
I'll just segue. Like it will be incredibly relevant if the right conditions are set that we can get into a protracted close combat environment. But if you just lift the lens up a little bit, it's like there's a harder and harder set of circumstances that to be able to, if we're to be when we're operating in our primary littoral environment, like there's a probably narrower and narrower window of where the right conditions would have to be set that we'd see that.
Yeah.
Sorry, I interrupted.
No, so if we come back to Armour though, so we've talked about offensive support, we've talked about UAS, and then I suppose command arms teams-ish, and trench warfare.
Yep.
What about armoured large, like earlier days, large armoured columns being targeted and stuff? What's the sort of current circumstances with armoured and the use of artillery? Yeah.
Well, significant armoured vehicle and A vehicle losses, like is probably the first thing to say. Like that's... so some metrics around 20,000 armoured vehicles and units of equipment of various natures have been destroyed, at least on the Russian side since the beginning of the war. In the order of 6,000 or 7,000 sort of tanks and various A vehicles casualties that we've seen. The key point about that is, and you mentioned it in terms of these, the Russians have gone in expecting this to be an offensive push into Kiev. Haven't really resourced the logistics, supply and support to be able to do that, and have been, absolutely pumped on the way in. But a lot of the losses, at least in the early days, significantly contributed by poor tactics. So bunching up, operating in columns, moving by roads, to some extent that's constrained with the geography of the Ukraine, but, a significant part of the A vehicle and, various armoured vehicle losses over that time were because of not following fundamental tactical procedures that we would take for granted, certainly on the Russian side. Now then what happens is, or certainly is what the Russians have experienced, is what few experienced crew you've got are dying. And so you got a compounding effect because the ones that are coming in are relatively fresh, don't have a lot of experience, equal, and just continue to contribute to the same thing. Where we're typically seeing armour, or at least the latest reports on where armour is being employed, is sort of within 3 kilometres of the flot, buried, like dug in, and largely in sort of counter-attack, counter-penetration roles. Well, that's the sort of state now. And when they're used offensively, they're used under an envelope of EMS and jamming in the circumstances where they can mass those. Because as we talked before, is like any time you mass conventionally, the surveillance environment is such that you can identify and target that mass conventional force. So they're massing and being used offensively when they can set the appropriate conditions to be able to do that. Again, it comes back, I keep coming back, it's the same, it's adaptation of TTPs. So I was sort of reflecting on this morning because one of the questions that came out of our brief was like, hey, because I talked about various techniques that were being used to bypass active protection systems. And so some really interesting stuff that's come out of both Israel and the Ukraine around various techniques are used to bypass that, of like top-down attack munitions, using loitering munitions to drop, explosives that won't aren't moving fast enough to sort of trigger the active protection system, using multiple projectiles to overwhelm the system, all the way, through to, we talked about the example of just planting by hand something on the side of it, or using, there's really good success, or some reports of success of using Bradleys to blind the sensors on a main battle tank. So it's like, great, I haven't you're essentially an M kill because you can't see anything. You've essentially neutralized that, but we haven't triggered we're using 30 and 40 mil. We're not triggering the active protection system because it's not a anti-tank round. We got the question during the brief of like, hey, does this mean that it's an overmatch of the tank? I think, again, it's like anything. Don't over-attribute a single platform or capability as being the thing that's going to win you the war, but also don't go the other way of going, this platform or system is now redundant. That's not true for armoured vehicles. Well, I would say that the Ukraine hasn't made the case that armoured vehicles are no longer relevant. What has to happen, though, is that your use of a platform or a weapon system has to change. So the example I use is tanks were being used in the clearance of Mosul, 2016, 2017. But they were being used in, I had a writer that was talking about micro combat teams of a armoured bulldozer, a tank, an infantry section, and a sniper pair, essentially. That's what the Iraqi security forces were using to clear Mosul. Now, what that illustrates is it's not the platform. What has to pivot is how we visualize the use of that platform. That's the thing that has to pivot. So that's true for A vehicles. That's what's evidenced by the conflict. Yeah.
And before you talked about armored vehicles now, adaptation in armored vehicles and the sensors and the like as well. You talked before about using drones like an ammunition rather than a capability, and then subsequently made the argument that logistics was sort of not well considered in the Russian advance toward Kiev.
Yeah.
Let's talk to logistics.
These
large rates of I've heard open source media talking about 10,000 rounds in the initial stages of the fire, 10,000 artillery rounds.
20,000.
20,000 artillery rounds per day.
Well, it's down to 10,000 a day on average now.
Insane amounts. And then we're talking about drones being included in large resupply into what I've sort of suggested would be like an ammo point and the like.
Yeah.
Can we talk to logistics?
Yeah.
What sort of, not only the capabilities and sort of how it's evolved, but also the adaptation of logistics?
Yeah, well, what it's illustrated is that you have to have protected logistics, and you have to think about your operational through to tactical logistics as the enabler of your operations, because the proliferation of long-range fires and surveillance means that you don't have a protected rear area. So where the Russians came unstuck in a lot of ways around logistics, but where they're still struggling is they've got the ability to pump enormous volumes of people and material into Ukraine. Once it gets into Ukraine, they struggle with the tactical distribution of logistics. They don't have palletized, or they haven't had effective palletization. The dispersal of maneuver forces has forced logistics systems to pivot with them, but that means you don't have economies of scale. You can't stockpile and cache in the way that you might have become accustomed to. So it's an incredible challenge for logistics, and making your logistics system work. Well, the conflict would illustrate that's a critical part of it. Protecting logistics, particularly at the forward, just behind the forward area, but like out to sort of 40 to 100 kilometers back from that, from strike and from interdiction, that becomes incredibly important. Interestingly, kind of strategic sort of disruption of supply chains. So special forces in Russia targeting rail networks and rail lines and stuff hasn't been particularly impactful based on the reports we've seen. So there's an interesting, thing there of going, hey, mass is really the thing that is most important around this, and your ability to sustain volumes of material. That's the really decisive factor. So it forces a consideration of logistics. Well, I mean, this is not new. Like, this is something, all military professionals should have been thinking about all the time. But your ability to get away with not having thought through protection of your logistics chain, like, you don't have that liberty anymore. And what we saw from the Russians is a lot of improvised method, trying a whole bunch of ways to sort of protect these trucks, rudimentary armor, like not having enough, supplied, trucks and B vehicles and stuff to be able to sustain the fight and everything like that. Certainly in the early stages, that was one of the things. Essentially, is the thing that undid the advance on Kiev, was the fact that they couldn't sustain and couldn't protect those lines of communication. Yeah.
And then that's all sort of, you did talk about repair and stuff as well, but getting stuff into the forward area.
Yeah.
But if we talk about getting casualties back, I suppose how's that? It's the same in reverse, I suppose, or is there more?
And KIA and captured personnel, it's a similar problem set of going, if you are operating in this environment where you're under a constant surveillance and under pretty consistent fires out to sort of 40 kilometres, that presents an enormous challenge to how you can essentially support casualty evacuation, all that kind of stuff. the Ukrainians are experimenting, or the Ukrainians and Russians are experimenting with a whole bunch of use of UAVs to support, not necessarily, in some cases, Casovac, using unmanned ground vehicles to support Casovac, but also dropping medical supplies just in time to, casualties being treated in the forward areas. But there's no, like, that requires a whole of force consideration of how you build and protect that evacuation and sort of casualty management system, because you need to consider your casualty backflow back to 200 to 300 kilometres, in terms of where you site and connect those medical facilities so that you can sort of facilitate that. And harrowing stories coming out of the Ukraine about, combat medics, treating and stabilising casualties for up to 24 hours in a forward trench, only to have them killed by a UAV a kilometre back as part, when they're during the Casovac process. So it requires a very deliberately planned, structured and protected system to enable that, both supply in and extraction out of casualties, to be able to support the force.
I suppose that's we've talked about long range precision strike, UAS, armoured vehicles, artillery more broadly.
Yeah.
Now logistics and the reverse, Casovac and the like as well, pulling stuff out of the fight. And you've already touched on it, that relevance of trench warfare and a land conflict, large-scale land conflict between two nations that share a land border.
Yep.
If we zoom out a bit to Australia and specifically us for our primary operating environment, what sort of lessons learned can we take, and what analysis should we be doing on some of the stuff that we think is now relevant and back in vogue, when in reality that's not actually the case for a number of different things in our primary operating environment?
Yeah, it is the point for us, right? Like that, what we're watching is a conflict that is adapted to the geography and specific strategic circumstances of the Ukraine. So we have to be very circumspect about what lessons we take from it. The prevalence and importance of operations in the EMS, I think, is one thing that will carry over directly. And frankly, that adversaries have been operating in the EMS environment, and we've been vulnerable in the EMS environment for well before the Ukraine. It's just, this is a case study that is illustrating that. Like, we've been findable in the EMS based on our transmissions, for a long time. It's just most people don't think about it or plan for it. That's the thing that will carry across directly. I will be interested on the basis of expeditionary operations, and particularly operations in the littoral environment, that has impacts for force flows and supply. We have to obviously consider that in and of itself as a tactical consideration, but that will almost certainly affect the force flow of UAS. There's some circumstances where if you're fighting in an urban centre, depending on sort of how that sort of works, and there is a population that can be used as a vector to bring in supply and stuff like that might change it. But for most of the scenarios we envisage in terms of the use of the land force, UAS will be like the ability to actually get those UAS into that environment will be the same as like how hard it is to get artillery shells in. So that will almost certainly affect the prevalence of those systems. And the nature of the geography of our primary operating area means that they're almost certainly not going to be quite as effective in terms of providing that saturation of surveillance, because we're talking about jungle, mountain.
Yeah, you have a canopy to cover you.
It's much more complex terrain.
And difficult to strike through a canopy, I'd imagine, rather than just open ground.
Yeah. And I think the other thing that'll carry is it will be under a strike envelope. It's just that strike envelope will be from maritime and air platforms predominantly, rather than an abundance of land-based fires. Because, again, based on the nature of littoral and expeditionary operations, that will be what will change. That may have impacts on the volume and saturation of fires that we can expect to see, because you can't mass fires from maritime and air in the same way that you can if you have the ability to mass land-based fires. So that might change, or we might see that as different. I think as well, the thing is, like, we have to think about our operations in the maritime much more. So I think what will be far more impactful for us as a land force is the use and adaptation around unmanned surface vessels. So when we talk to how we as a land force can make a disproportionate impact on a joint maritime operating environment, the lesson we can take from the Ukraine is their very effective use of unmanned surface vessels to sink Russian warships. that's something I think we need to think about in terms of our role as the land force. What I would extrapolate as the thing that we can take from the Ukraine as a lesson directly that will be impactful for us in our POE. The final point is, like, when you're doing expeditionary operations, the alignment of the nation and people whose ground you're fighting on becomes one of, if not the decisive factor. Say Ukraine is defending its sovereign territory. That's not a factor that is necessarily going to weigh one way or another. But if we are fighting an adversary on a third-party territory, their support, their alignment is going to be the decisive factor. So that needs to be the part that we need to consider as part of our planning and thinking, and that isn't necessarily what we're seeing in the Ukraine now.
So that's, I suppose, what we can and can't take into our primary operating environment. But more broadly, if we zoom out to adaptation and the culture within, because you've spoken about culture a couple of times throughout, and how we need to keep up with these or think about things in a different way. Yeah. What are your key takeaways for anyone listening about adaptation and culture and how we should think about warfare?
Yeah, I think what I'd say up front is, like, there's a really big effort, and I think our senior leadership is thinking a lot about this. And I think a lot of what we're seeing in terms of the changes that are being driven for Army are trying to work towards a much more adaptive way of thinking and way of fighting. But to pitch it something I think is a little more accessible, I sort of think about two practical things that you could probably do, because it is about fostering a culture of adaptation. I've been around long enough to have deployed on contingency operations where, so I'm thinking of Timor, but what struck me when I went on those when I've gone on a contingency operation is, like, at short notice, is we actually do adapt, and what was striking to me is that when we got on the ground and had a mission to achieve, we pivoted on TTPs and sort of adapted really quickly to the conditions on the ground and were pretty resilient to sort of, changing things. So I actually have a great deal of confidence that it's certainly at the soldier and unit level, we actually can pivot. And
I think a story that epitomises that it sort of is the infill into Timor, but so 2RAR an amphibious amphibious regiment, and then 3RAR paratroopers at the time, they were jumping in. They switch roles, and 2RAR sort of went by air into FET, and 3RAR gets on boats. It's like we're starting to adapt immediately because the infill is completely different. Do you know what I mean?
Well, yeah, it was. I was with 3rd 4th Cavalry Regiment at the time, and doing patrols of Dili, and you drop your AP, you go out in your APCs, make a bunch of noise, then bring it back, and then you get into land cruisers because that's the only way you can actually get around and not totally disturb all the community. And the only way you're actually going to find gangs and things like that is to present a low profile. But what more significantly about that is, it's about adaptation to the conditions on the ground. So I'm actually really optimistic we can do it. But what you can do to set the conditions, I think, are two things. The first is foster the evolutionary pressure that has driven the adaptation in the Ukraine conflict now. And the way to do that is, if you are resourced to do that, train for overwhelming odds. You don't drive adaptation of your TTPs and use of platforms and capabilities in unique ways if you are facing a near peer or conveniently slightly overmatched adversary enemy. There's no driver to adaptation. Now, there's other reasons why we train to those things like that. There's a bigger system, but if you can train to 5-on-1, 10-on-1, odds, because that's where you're fostering a culture at the junior NCO and soldier level of being able to adapt really quickly and learning when and how to change how they do business in the face of pressure. The second is professional mastery. So it's about having a deeper understanding of the philosophies and drivers of why you apply TTPs the way that you do. Because if you understand the deeper principles, the fundamentals of fire and maneuver, the fundamentals of, why we apply a specific doctrine or tactics or TTPs, you can keep those core philosophies, those fundamental things that are really important, but pivot how you apply them much more quickly. So it's about being, you got to understand your business well enough to know what's important so that when it comes to it, you can drop the stuff that's not, or you can pivot on that. So training to difficult odds or training to adversity, and professional mastery, so you know the fundamental philosophies and principles of what the warfighting is that you're doing, so that you can pivot off those principles when you come to it. That's the most practical thing you can do, and you can do it at any level. And the final point, and I said 2 points, but I meant 3. There's a three-way relationship between what I'd kind of characterize as the essential factors necessary for warfighting, which is effective operational through to strategic leaders that can both fight for the supplies and support needed to sustain the war, but also can give good direction, can direct things so that people can win. Operational through to strategic supply. So that's both being able to marshal and mobilize the resources to sustain the fight, but also get it to the warfighter and disperse it. And then the third is people that can actually fight wars and win. So junior NCOs, senior NCOs, junior officers that are capable of fighting and winning battles. So that's everything from the discipline, and the fundamentals of discipline, good procedures, good tactics. Those are the factors that mean that forces actually can fight, that win the battles. And those things are interdependent. Strategic leaders can't win resources and mobilize resources and win international support if they're not showing they're winning enough battles, if they're not showing that they're in the fight. Strategic and logistics supply can't work if they're not protected, if they're not supported by maneuver, and they don't have the space to operate. But then reciprocally, you can't fight and win if you're not being put in the right battles, and you can't fight and win if you're not being resourced. Yeah. And the historical precedents for this were the Germans and the Japanese in the Second World War. Where once you get on a cascade of losing your good junior NCOs, good junior officers, and not replacing them, you lose more and more battles. So there's a real interdependency thing. The Ukraine's really is showing the exact same thing. So we're seeing that playing out, particularly on the Ukrainian side. I think the lesson from that is to understand what we, at every level, our contribution to that. There's a limit to what we can do in terms of mobilize, how we can affect mobilization of resources and strategic leaders. But we can think about our end of the logistics problem. We can think about how we get logistics to troops. We can think about how we grow both operational leaders and the staff that support them so they can make good operational decisions. But probably most importantly, we can think about growing and being effective soldiers, because in aggregate, that it is as important as anything else that we are good at warfighting and good at the fundamentals of warfighting, because it is as significant. It is part of that fundamental premise of being able to sustain and win wars. It's more about you can look at something like the Ukraine and look at how big it is, and look at how much of it is to do with things like strategic supply and all these kind of things. It might be easy for a junior soldier or a junior officer to look at and go, well, what's my part of that? Being good at soldiering is as important a part of it, because in aggregate, those other things can't. If you're not fighting and winning battles, it's not going to work.
That is absolutely excellent, and an excellent way to end the episode. Lieutenant Colonel James Ellis-Smith, thank you so much, sir, for coming in. That's Ukraine, I suppose, a Ukraine-Russia conflict, and some adaptation in there as well, and how quickly things evolve and how we should be looking at warfighting. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thanks, mate.
Thanks for listening to the Cove Podcast. Explore our channel for more great audio PME content. Also, visit us at cove.army.gov.au for hundreds of additional resources. The Cove, the learning home of the Australian profession of arms.